The world is on edge once again. North Korea's sixth and most powerful nuclear detonation carried out on Sunday sent tremors, both literally and figuratively, across the region. Now, South Korea has beefed up its security and sanctioned the deployment of 6 U.S. missile defense systems. Intelligence reports from Seoul have warned that the North is preparing to launch an intercontinental ballistic missile, or an ICBM. To discuss all of this, we're joined by John Nilsson Wright, Senior Research Fellow at the Asia Program at the Chatham House from Paris. He's joining us on Skype. John, thank you so much for joining us on Bloomberg Quint. All right, John, before I actually dive right in to what happened over the last couple of days, just to give our viewers some sort of background, I wanted to start off by asking you, well, when it comes to this North Korea conflict, we're living in a world of tweets, retweets, likes and shares, where even heads of state are actually taking to Twitter in 140 characters and actually dictating policy. Just to understand where all of this conflict actually began, could you just take us through that?
Well, you have to really fundamentally go back to 1950 and the Korean War to find the really beginning of this conflict. Korea, of course, divided as a result of the end of World War II. 2 states had emerged in the aftermath of World War II. South Korea backed by the United States, North Korea supported by the Soviet Union, and dramatically in June of 1950, of course, then leader of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, launched a surprise invasion of the South, which led to the 3 years of the Korean War, a bitter and divisive conflict that involved not just Koreans fighting against one another, but of course the United Nations Command, representing the United States and its allies, and of course on the other side, supporting North Korea, China and Russia. And that's of course very important in understanding the position of China and Russia today. China, which remains an ally of North Korea. But since that war, which is yet to be resolved, temporarily suspended, albeit for many, many years as a result of the armistice agreements of 1953, the peninsula has been mired in conflict and division, and the competing ambitions of those 2 Korean states to represent the entire peninsula. The conflict today, of course, reflects not only the legacy of that bitter war, but also the ambitions of North Korea to become an independent nuclear state. North Korea, we shouldn't forget, has had its eye on acquiring its own nuclear assets since at least the 1960s. But it's only in recent years, particularly under Kim Jong-un and his father before him, Kim Jong-il, that the North Koreans have been able to make material progress in advancing towards that ambition of becoming a credible, independent nuclear power.
Right, John, and it's interesting because, well, this is the 6th and perhaps most major nuclear test that's actually happened. And it happened at the same time as the opening of the BRICS summit, where China seems to be against protectionism and really leading the efforts out there. But China effectively is North Korea's only ally and perhaps their biggest financial benefactor. And that's because Beijing fears that, well, the collapse of the Kim regime would destabilize the northeastern borders, as well as remove a historical, strategic buffer that they've enjoyed for the longest time. If you could also take us through where China comes in to this whole conflict.
Well, as you rightly point out, China is North Korea's principal supporter and ally. In material terms, 90% of the energy and food that North Korea relies on comes from China. And North Korea is, for China, of course, its critically important strategic and economic backyard. It's understandable why the Chinese, because of their alliance relationship with North Korea, are averse to doing anything that would undermine the political stability of the North Korean regime. They worry that any undue pressure on Pyongyang might lead to the collapse of the regime, creating in turn a strategic power vacuum in the north that would be filled potentially by the United States and also by its American ally, creating in turn a strategic challenge to China on its 800-mile border with North Korea. The Chinese, of course, also worry that anything that tipped North Korea into chaos would lead to a mass exodus of people from the north, which has a population of about 23 million people. This would pose a major security threat to the Chinese government. Leaving aside that question, of course, is the medium and long-term consequences of this current military standoff. North Korea's military belligerency has, of course, raised fears in China of an escalating arms race in the region. The Chinese look to South Korea and see President Moon, the recently elected progressive leader of South Korea, now embracing the idea of missile defense, something that the Chinese firmly oppose. They worry about the willingness of President Trump, a new leader in the United States, who's seen by the Chinese as, like many people, I think, seen as a rather erratic, impulsive, thin-skinned, and therefore dangerously unpredictable leader. They worry that President Trump might be willing to sanction military action, and that this would inevitably lead to a conflagration on the peninsula into which China might be drawn as an ally of North Korea, something that it desperately wants to avoid. The big question for China and also for other countries is what can be done to persuade the North Koreans to be more moderate in their approach and to suspend, if not roll back, their WMD program. It's a very difficult challenge, and there are very real limits on what China can achieve.
Right, John, and it becomes very interesting when you were talking about President Trump, because the White House is considering a range of actions like cutting off economic ties with countries that do business with North Korea. Now, according to a tweet by President Trump, of course, that's what he said on Sunday. China happens to be the North Korea's biggest trade partner, so it seemed like that was something that was directed at China. What I want to understand from you is, over the years, how did the US get involved in a conflict thousands of miles away from it? I think that's something that's imperative for the viewers to understand.
Well, again, you have to go back to the Cold War and recognize that, in the aftermath of World War II, the United States assumed a global role, a role that was uncharacteristic for the United States that in the pre-1945 era, of course, had flirted with the idea of isolationism. The American First Movement back in the 1920s, the one that, in a sense, Donald Trump echoes in his own re-articulation of that concept of America First. That America was replaced by a much more outward-looking United States after 1945. Under the leadership of Harry Truman, the Americans decided that it was in their strategic and economic interests to have a presence in the Far East. They, of course, having defeated Japan, were the country that occupied Japan and helped Japan recover from the ravages of World War II. But also from as early as 1945, it was American troops who were the forefront of the liberation of colonial Korea, the Korean Peninsula, which had been occupied for some 35 years by Imperial Japan. And it was for that reason that the Americans found themselves in a country that many ordinary American citizens knew very little about, and yet through the vagaries of history and chance and unexpected developments, this became the front line of the Cold War in East Asia, a Cold War that ultimately turned hot with devastating results for ordinary Koreans in 1950. And it was the need to protect the interests of South Korea and also by extension Japan, America's most important base in East Asia, not only from the threat of North Korea, but also from the broader threat of international communism. Kim Il-sung's attack on South Korea was seen by the Americans as the first stage in a wider campaign by Moscow and its Chinese ally Beijing to export communism within the region and further afield. And that explains why it was the United States that made the case, together with the United Nations, for an international peacekeeping activity to provide the first line of defense against the spread of international communism.
So North Korea conducted its first ever nuclear test in 2006. And it's interesting because they've been conducting several nuclear tests ever since. What I wanted to ask you, John, as a last question, was what's led to this conflict escalating over the last few days? If you could just take us through what the real cause is, because the whole world is watching this with bated breath, because clearly it has ramifications for the world at large.
Well, I think at one level this is simply a reflection of the momentum that the North Koreans have acquired in terms of their technological advancement. Kim Jong-un has surprised the international community by the speed with which he and his scientific advisors have been able to make great advances in terms of missile technology and also, of course, very dramatically in the testing of nuclear weapons. 2 nuclear tests last year in 2016, followed up, of course, on Sunday by this much more dramatic test of what we think was a hydrogen bomb, the first time the North Koreans have been able to test a thermonuclear device. The reason why I think this is happening so quickly is North Korea is impatient to secure a credible nuclear deterrent Kim Jong-un knows that in the face of international opposition, he has a limited amount of time to acquire this technology, and he's eager to show the rest of the world that he will not be deterred by the threats coming from the United States and from Donald Trump in particular. It's also, I think, a reflection of the fact that for the young leader, who's only been in power now approximately 5 to 6 years, having taken over in December of 2011 following the death of his father, it's important for him to demonstrate progress in terms of military modernization to bolster his position with his own people. And that desire for legitimacy is very important to him. The evidence all indicates that ordinary North Koreans, particularly the residents of Pyongyang, welcome this sort of technical progress. They see it as a measure of the strength of the country. It's a source of great national pride. And therefore, it's easy to understand why there is both this international agenda, a security priority that the North wants to realize by acquiring that deterrent capability, and this important domestic political need that young Kim Jong-un feels to understand why he's been moving so quickly. The other factor, which I think is also important, is that Donald Trump himself, by being so belligerent in terms of his rhetoric, threatening military action, grandstanding with the young leader, has in a sense provided an easy target for Kim Jong-un to try and thumb his nose at the Americans and to demonstrate his autonomy, his independence, and his commitment to advancing that goal of military modernization.
Right, John, and when it comes to the North Korean conflict, you've been tracking, the Korean Peninsula for over 20 years now. What I wanted to ask you really is, John, that the UN has obviously imposed several sanctions on North Korea over the years. Is there some sort of a panacea to this problem, according to you? Will more sanctions help? Are more sanctions the answer to this problem?
More sanctions may help. If you can secure international agreement, if you can secure a collective will to put more pressure on North Korea, then I suppose ultimately, if one's taking a long-term perspective, economic pressure, maybe even political and diplomatic sanctions, an attempt to signal very clearly to North Korea that if it continues to provoke, it will become increasingly more isolated. That might help along the way to slow down North Korea's modernization agenda. But I don't think it's going to work in the short term, because what Kim Jong-un, I think, probably wants, as far as we can tell, it's very hard to divine the true intentions of the young leader. What he appears to want is first to secure that credible military deterrent, a guarantee, an insurance policy, if you like, to guard against any potential attack from the United States. Once he's got that, his second agenda goal is economic growth. He's also promised this to his people, and he needs to deliver some meaningful economic progress. It may be the case that he feels that once the country's borders, if you like, are secure, once he has that deterrent capability, then he might be willing to trade some of it, or at least make some concession in the form of agreeing no longer to test nuclear weapons or to test long-range missiles in return for a relaxation of economic sanctions. So it may be the case that sanctions themselves become part of the bargaining process. To do that, of course, the United States and its allies, but particularly Washington, has to show a willingness to engage with North Korea. The problem at the moment is there is no sign that the Trump administration is willing to do that. President Trump has, in a sense, backed himself into something of a corner, and I think it explains the frustration that many people feel when they see the United States, which after all is still the world's indispensable superpower, apparently powerless to really affect any meaningful change on the peninsula.
All right, John, thank you so much for joining us on Bloomberg Quint. We appreciate you taking our time and joining us.